My name's Ellen Clarke, and I'm the director of the Leeds Centre for History and Philosophy of Science, and I'm here with Professor Helen Beebee. It's a beautiful afternoon here in Leeds. So, Helen, how's it going?
Yeah, so I've been here, 10 weeks or something, I don't know. And I really love it here. Everyone in history and philosophy of science and at school more generally has just been really welcoming. The students seem really nice. I mean, I moved from Manchester, so I kind of switched like one red brick university in a northern industrial city for another one. So in some ways, you know, things aren't that different. But it's a really what's really a new experience for me is just to have a lot of philosophers of science like yourself around the place, and also some historians of science as colleagues as well. So, and I really already feel like I'm kind of reaping the benefits of that. And there's you know, tons of non-philosophy of science philosophers here as well. And so it's like I feel like there just aren't enough hours in the day to go to all the reading groups and seminars and things that I want to go to, which is a really nice position to be in, actually. I think I need to go to sort of not as many of them as I have been doing. Otherwise, I'll never get anything else done. But it's been really nice. It's been really nice.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear that. I mean, we're really happy to have you here. So you arrived in Leeds. Is it a couple of months now? Yeah, it must be already. You're our new professor of philosophy of science. So we're delighted to have you in our community now. So yeah, you mentioned that you've just come from a post in Manchester. You've been in various different places in the country before that. Am I right that you did your undergraduate in Warwick initially and your PhD in London at King's College?
Yep, that's right. Yeah.
Who was your supervisor there?
It was the lovely David Papineau. And he was great. So my thesis was mostly about type level causation, so like smoking causes cancer, what makes that true, or whatever. And I think I read something of his, sorry, there's an aeroplane going over. I read something of his on that topic and kind of liked it and thought, oh, well, I'll do that for my PhD then. And he said, all right then. And what was he like? He was pretty hands-off, to be honest, but I kind of in a good way. I think he basically just kind of like trusted me to get on with it and do a good job. And once I realized that was what he was doing, that kind of gave me quite a lot of confidence. But he was always, you know, he was always there when I needed him, which was good. And at one point, I kind of went off at a bit of a tangent from my PhD topic, and I got interested in kind of like how and why we should align our degrees of belief with the objective probabilities and which objective probabilities we should align them with. And David really liked it, and we ended up co-authoring a paper that got into the Journal of Philosophy, which I think that probably had a massive effect on my employment prospects. So I've definitely, you know, got a lot to thank him for, because I never would have. The second half of the paper is all kind of like many worlds Everettian quantum mechanics-y stuff, which I thought was at the time was just completely batty. So I was a little bit, you know, I would not have sent this paper to the Journal of Philosophy because I just didn't, it wasn't that I didn't have confidence in that bit. I wouldn't have remotely thought of myself as someone that could publish there. And he was like, no, just send it off. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. So.
Oh, great. Yeah, because obviously the Journal of Philosophy is kind of one of the top philosophy journals, one of the top general philosophy journals. So I'm sure that had a massive boost on everything afterwards, you know, to publish that during your PhD.
Yeah, never published in that since.
What about immediately afterwards? I know you've spent time in Australia, but was that straight away following your PhD, or was it a while later?
Yeah, so I had a couple of three. I had 2 temporary jobs before I finished my PhD, which you were allowed to take a bit longer over in those days. So I had temporary jobs in Edinburgh and St Andrews, and then I finished my PhD, and I had a 1-year job at UCL in London, and then I had a postdoc at ANU in Canberra, which was fantastic.
Yeah, so it's a place I've spent a bit of time as well. So I thought I'd ask you about what you thought about Canberra, how you found it. Did you ever? It's a kind of famous anecdote about people visiting Canberra, which is the sort of administrative centre of Australia, isn't it? There's an anecdote from people that visit there in the summer often get attacked by the resident magpies. Did that ever happen to you?
Yeah, no, I did. I managed to not be attacked, but I did the very first morning I was there, and I was staying on campus, and I just got woken up at kind of like 6 o'clock in the morning by this just absolute racket, and I was kind of like half asleep and jet lagged, and I thought, like, have loads of car alarms just gone off or something? Like, what is that noise? And it turned to me, why it's just birds. Australian birds are just really, really, really noisy. But yeah, so the magpies didn't give me any grief, but luckily. But I do. The kids all had like little eye. Did you remember seeing that they would have these little eye stickers on their bike helmets, so that if they got attacked,
right, or sometimes cable ties poking out of it. Yeah,
I didn't see the cable ties. Yeah, so the magpie would like go for the helmet and not for the actual eyes. Yeah. Weird, yeah, weird. Like dangerous birds. That was a new thing. Dangerous and noisy birds. They were new things on me. Very strange.
You expect dangerous things, dangerous animals in Australia, but not necessarily birds. It's
yeah.
Who was there? Who was around at the time?
Oh,
did you go and visit someone in particular?
No, so I was there for 2 years on a postdoc, and it was just I was in that mode that many people will be familiar with, where you're just sending your CV off left, right, and centre, and not paying that much attention to which ones you've heard back from or whatever, because it's kind of like that's just draining to be constantly knocked back from getting positions or getting shortlisted. So I just sent this application off, and then I got a phone call from Philip Pettit, and I think he got the time difference wrong, because it was like 6 o'clock in the morning and I was in bed.
Oh, and you answered.
He said, we'd like to, luckily I had a phone by the bed, and he said, yeah, we'd like to offer you a postdoc. And again, it was one of these kind of like, am I dreaming? Is this really like, and no interview or anything, just a phone call saying, do you want the job? And I just went, oh yeah, wow, that'd be nice. And then I kind of like went back to sleep for a bit. It was really strange.
And then presumably really worried that it was a dream.
So and there were just loads of, it was such a great place to do philosophy. So there were the staff who were there. So Philip was there, Michael Smith was there, Daniel Stolger was there, still is there, and a bunch of other people, but also just lots of visiting people would visit for, and they wouldn't just visit for a week, they'd visit for kind of like a couple of months, so you'd get to know them. So Dave Chalmers was there a lot, David Lewis obviously passed through now and again. A whole ton of people who I kind of know now, who I first met, sitting in the Fellows Garden at ANU drinking a beer.
Lovely. So I know David Lewis has been a hugely influential person on your work. What was he like? What was he like to hang out with?
I mean, I did not hang out with David Lewis very much. I think I met him a few times in Australia and then a couple of times in other places afterwards. I found him completely terrifying. I mean, he wasn't terrifying. He was incredibly kind of just mild-mannered and gentle. And I'm sure if I'd said something that he thought was philosophically, really dumb, he would have just, quietly and gently set me straight without giving any indication that he thought that I said something really dumb. Nonetheless, I found it completely terrifying. But he just, and also difficult because he just didn't do small talk at all. I mean, he could talk about philosophy and trains and Aussie rules football and beer, I think. But anything else was just like,
many ends.
He wasn't interested in talking about anything else. So you'd ask him a question and he'd just go, yep. And so it was quite painful. But we did exchange some faxes though, very old school, on the topic of causation by absence, which was very cool. And I did have enough confidence to do that because I could, prepare and, write it all down and think about it. So I still got the faxes somewhere, obviously.
Right. Precious.
Yeah.
So I was going to get to causation. I was going to get to what you actually work on, what you're known for. Simplifying massively, one of the things that you're most known for is your work on Hume, and you're one of the sort of preeminent Hume sort of specialists in the world, right? Particularly Hume on induction and causation. Would you say, is it worth asking you to sort of, say very quickly what your position on Hume is, or what your sort of main intervention is?
Yes, so I've got a book and a couple of papers which are on Hume on causation and induction, and so my basic line is, and some of this is more controversial than other bits of it, but it's kind of all right. So we have induction, we infer stuff from on the basis of past regularities to the right. So Hume's interested in causation, right? Why is he interested in causation? Well, causation is kind of like, I think, was it Mackie that said, for us, it's the cement that glues everything together. But the for us, I think, is very important for Hume. So it's we see and think of the world in causal terms because that's just like cognitively incredibly important to us. Like it's like you need to act in a way that means that you're not going to get run over by a truck or poisoned or whatever. And thinking of the world in causal terms for Hume, I think, is a kind of like cognitive shortcut for kind of like compared to kind of like having to do all this like tedious inference and kind of consulting your memory and such like, which is just like way too much effort and is bound to lead to bad things happening to you. So he's interested in causation because he's interested in our ability to predict the future. And as it turns out, he thinks that the nature of causation, this is not controversial, this bit, the nature of causation is to be understood in terms of our ability to predict the future. So now he's interested in how we get to infer stuff about what's going to happen from the past and the familiar story. You get this kind of regularity established in your mind. When this thing happens, that other thing always happens afterwards. And now we infer that other thing's going to happen, we can do it by conscious inference, but mostly we don't. Mostly it's just habit, right? It's just automated. You see the truck coming towards you and you move out of the way. You're not thinking, oh, truck, danger, better get out of the way. You just move, right? And then somehow or other, the notion of causation depends on that kind of habit of inference. But now the question is, well, what is causation, right? You've said like how it is that we get to kind of have the concept, but what is it out there in the world? Like typical metaphysician question to ask. And I think Hume's view is, well, we're just projecting, right? There's just nothing out there that answers to in the fabric of reality that answers to that concept. Not even, constant conjunction. I mean, there is constant conjunction out there, but that's just the thing that prompts us to make the causal judgments. It's not, as it were, part of the nature of causation. There's kind of nothing out there that answers to the concept. What there is us projecting our expectations onto the world. Like that's what it is. So when so I sort of have this kind of projectivist expressivist line on this, which lots of people really hate, which is kind of like, you say that one thing caused another, you're expressing a certain kind of expectation about what's going to happen. That's all you're doing. But also, and this is the really controversial part, I think that it sort of modifies the way that you see the world, right? So I want to say Hume thinks that we really do experience things as of one thing causing another thing. Like most people think he doesn't think that, but I think he does. But again, it's not an experience of some feature of reality that like some little relation between the cause and effect that we're kind of like, visually observing through our senses. We're projecting that habit of expectation somehow or other so that we come to see the two things happening next to each other as things that are causally connected. So it's like what I see is one thing makes another thing happen. Or my experience is as of one thing making another thing happen, but what's really going on there is one thing happens, the other thing happens, I project this expectation, that modifies my visual experience. That's the story. And that's a nice story, and one that is kind of like, is sort of out there in the kind of metaphysics of causation literature, but I'm inclined to think it's something like that has got more going for it than most people tend to assume.
So it's a sort of quirk of human psychology, as it were, that we do this thing, that we have this habit of expecting things, or that we impute causation. But in actual fact, there is no sort of natural necessity. It's something we're sort of making up.
Right. Yeah. And it's not just a quirk, right? It's an incredibly useful and important quirk, right? If you can just kind of see, just by looking at it, that the truck is, if you don't get out of the way, going to run you over. That's really useful, right? The fact that it's automated and the fact that you're actually kind of, as it were, the experience is presenting the things to you in that way. So it's like your experience is, what's the right way to put it? It's kind of like this is this massive shortcut, right? You don't need to do any conscious thinking at all. Right. It's just right there in front of your eyes. That's really useful if you want to go about your life without being eaten by tigers or run over by trucks or whatever.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, maybe this is at the root of why some people find it controversial. What explains the usefulness of that sort of habit if there is no underlying natural necessity? Why is that often a good thing to be doing if it's not based on anything?
Oh, right. Well, yeah. Okay. So I guess the answer to that is just prediction, right? We're latching on to it's our mechanism, our sort of automated mechanism for latching onto the regularities. And that's, I mean, obviously it's Hume, right? It's sort of overly simplistic in various kinds of ways. But it's a really good first stab, I think, at trying to understand why it is that this is a useful concept for us, right? And it is just, it's prediction. That's what we need it for. And it's never going to be certain prediction. It's always going to be kind of fallible.
Right.
But, that's the way it goes.
And is it important that there's that sort of shortcut element of it, as you said, that it's heuristic, and it's kind of a shortcut for maybe some sort of underlying, much more complex, inference based on evidence or something?
Right. Yeah. And of course you can do the inference as well. I mean, and that's what science does, right? It's that's why science is better than just going around observing stuff, is because you're actually running the experiments and testing the regularities and coming up with causal hypotheses on the back of that. So it's not, it's not that the kind of conscious inference, high level theorizing about scientific theorizing about what causes what. It isn't useful or interesting. Like, that's really useful and interesting as well, but just from the point of view of kind of like day-to-day getting through life without dying or inflicting terrible harm on other people, you need it all to be automated, right? But yeah, there's some stuff you need the theorizing and the experimentation for, right?
Right. And then a lot of the time, just an automated habit is going to do the job. So I warned you I was going to ask you a slightly left field question about whether we might understand Hume as having anticipated predictive processing, which you were a bit like, what? So broadly, my understanding of predictive processing or predictive coding is that it's this kind of theory in psychology about how minds work that. I'm giving a kind of cartoon version here, but the idea is that your mind works by kind of creating like a model of what's going to happen, and setting your expectation about what's going to happen in line with kind of all the evidence that you've had so far, and trying to sort of avoid being surprised, basically trying to avoid situations when what actually happens doesn't match your predictions about what was going to happen. So my thought was that maybe in some sense psychologists are sort of still carrying on Hume's project of trying to sort of describe this psychological mechanism. What were your thoughts there?
So I think I know even less about predictive processing than you do. My understanding of it was more or less what you just said. But I guess I was thinking of it as specifically kind of visual thing, right? So your brain's making these predictions based on a bit of evolutionarily designed stuff, but largely on the basis of statistical regularities, right? About what things are going to look like in front of your eyes, right? And then that affects the way that you see the thing. And then if things don't turn out to look the way that you're expecting to, your brain kind of like updates. It does its Bayesian updating thing. And there's definitely some Hume in there, right? So you've got the unconscious prediction thing, right? That's on the basis of regularities. That's straight out of Hume. But also there's the bit of Hume that I just mentioned, which I kind of which is kind of controversial, which is the bit about kind of like the modification of the visual experience, right? So I like the thought that that there's that in Hume as well, that he's got in common with the predictive processing thing, like the kinds of expectations that are going on that your brain is delivering are affecting how you see stuff. Yeah, so right. Definitely Hume ought to be given credit for being, you know, founding father of predictive processing, except that founding father narratives are, you know, like almost always myths and, you know, perpetuate lazy stereotypes and so on. So, you know, maybe we shouldn't think of him as the founding father. But yeah, there's definitely, I think there's a lot of the same sorts of thoughts in there. I mean, just generally, I think of Hume as much more of a psychologist than a philosopher, really. You know, he was interested in, he kind of, you know, he thought he was doing the science of the mind, right? It's like, how does this thing work? Like, you know, here are the inputs, and now we do all this fancy stuff. How does that happen? Like, how do we get to bandy around all these concepts? What are we, yeah, how does that work? He's sort of much more interested in kind of like psychological mechanisms, I think, and then the kind of epistemology and the metaphysics kind of flow out to some extent from understanding what the psychological mechanisms are, but it all sort of starts from the psychology, I think. He makes a lot more sense if you read him as much more like a psychologist than you know, a metaphysician, I think.
Okay, so let's stick with this idea that you might describe him as the founding father of psychology. Given that we now have psychology, and I think, as you said in an interview once, that Hume was sort of doing psychology with a sample size of 1, right? So he was his only sole subject. He was trying to work out how the mind works by introspecting on his own mind. Given all of that, tell me why it still matters what Hume thought or what he wrote. Well, you know, why not think that things have just moved on and that he was doing something but doing it with poor methodology, and now we've got better methodology, you know? So why should we still listen to what he had to say?
Yeah, well, so I mean, there's a question that's sort of specific to Hume and what he had to say on this particular topic, and then there's kind of like a much more general question about like, why should we pay any attention to the history of philosophy more generally, given that what you just said about Hume kind of you know, most historical figures, their views have been superseded by much more sophisticated views. So I suppose on the particular question, I sort of think in a way that, for all that I just said, we should sort of think of him as more of a psychologist. There is a metaphysical claim there, right, about what's the nature of, you know, we have this concept, we apply it to the world. Hume's line when it comes to causation, in my view anyway, and indeed when it comes to things like ethics and aesthetics, is we absolutely shouldn't assume that by using this concept, we're just kind of like latching onto some feature of reality that's out there, right? We just shouldn't have a kind of like, we shouldn't assume that realism about this thing is the default position. Just because we've got a word and we apply it to the world doesn't mean there's a thing in the world that answers to it, or it might not be the thing that we're expecting that answers to it. And I think that, and that's a philosophical position, right? Psychologists kind of aren't interested in what's out there in the world particularly. And I think it's one that's the sort of, I think in a lot of the time in metaphysics, these days, there is a sort of, there's just an assumption that, well, we've got this word and we're using it in some kind of way that seems to communicate something to other people in metaphysics. And we're just going to assume that word picks something out in the world. And I always want to go, I'm not sure you should make that assumption. I mean, maybe there's something else going on here. So, yeah. So I think there's still sort of like there's a sort of general, I don't know, another way of thinking about metaphysics that you get in Hume that I still think, you know, there's something to be gained for taking that view seriously today, I think. And then there's a kind of, you know, there's a general point about the history of philosophy, I suppose. So, you know, I don't know a lot about history of philosophy, but there are people who kind of think, and say, oh, history of philosophy, that's for, you know, that's done by people that, you know, aren't very good at actual philosophy, or like it's a different thing to actual philosophy, and less valuable and important. And I think one thing that drives that sort of thought is the kind of like, well, Oh, well, look at philosophy. Philosophy's made these great strides, right? Philosophical theories, they're improving all the time. They're incredibly sophisticated and detailed compared to what you get in Aristotle or Hume or Kant. And that we've got much more evidence in than they had. So if we're interested in, getting the philosophy right, we don't need to look to the history. I mean, it's like if you want help with your quantum physics, like going and reading Newton is not going to help you, right? It might, in some very general sense, help you be a better physicist, but it's not going to help you with the specific problems that you're engaged with now because, things have moved on, different problems. But I kind of think, I sort of want to say that that's just not the right way to think about it. So it's kind of, it's an important fact about philosophy that, sometimes the strides it makes aren't nearly as great as people think they are. So people think they discovered something shiny and new, and actually it was kind of in Hume or Aristotle or Kant all along, which tells us something about the nature of the discipline, but also maybe if you went and looked at Hume or Aristotle or Kant, you'd find that those people had something interesting to say about that thing that in fact isn't a shiny new discovery at all, right? Like they got there before you. So what would maybe they've got something to say about it. Maybe there's something to learn about why it is that they got to that point that you've just got to. Yeah. So,
Or in the other direction, sometimes the sort of cutting edge of debates or the contemporary concepts are really kind of constrained by sort of threads that could be traced back to these earlier people that you're sort of not really aware of unless you're, and they might be good threads or they might be bad threads, but unless they're there, you can't kind of work that out.
Yeah, no, I completely think that's right. It's like I think we're extremely good at pretending that what we're doing is kind of like dispassionately, doing our scientific investigation or kind of like quasi-scientific investigation into the nature of reality. And who cares what people thought before, because these are the problems now and, these are the theories on the table. And, so much of that is contingent, right? Like, why are we thinking about this problem in these particular terms, right? Why are these the go-to available positions between which we have to choose? It's like that isn't coming to us from the that's coming to us from a tradition and a history, right? That tradition and history could have gone completely differently, and it's worth thinking about, and I think the fact that once you recognize the historical roots of the particular philosophical positions that you have come to know or the one that you've endorsed, that helps, I think, with a sort of sense of humility of kind of like, I've got a sense of the contingency now, because I know that if that person hadn't written that thing and these people hadn't then picked it up, I probably wouldn't have come to have the view that I've got now. Well, the debate would look very differently, and I don't know what it would look like, but just the fact that that idea that it might have looked very different, I think ought to make us think, gosh, maybe we're not quite the truth seekers that we might have thought that we were, or something.
Right. Or that there's often, I guess, potential areas of the logical space in a problem that we might not be seeing, that might be invisible to us.
Right.
Good. Okay, so that's a nice connecting idea to my next question. So one of the things that you've done in your career is tremendous amounts to try and sort of advance the position of women in philosophy. So I thought I'd challenge you to ask about a question. As someone who's spent a long time, sort of in the company of Hume, as it were, sort of getting to know him. How do you imagine might his work have been different if he had been a woman instead of a man? Is that a logical space we can access?
Let's do some counterfactual history, as Greg Raddick would say. Well, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because if he'd been a woman, he almost certainly wouldn't have been in a position to do any philosophy, for starters, right? It's like, he went. I'm not big on Hume biography, but like I think he went to university before he was a teenager, and then just kind of like spent 10 years, thinking about stuff on his own in a room. Not an opportunity that would have been available to most women, unless they were incredibly online.
He wasn't busy with laundry much.
Wasn't much busy with laundry or raising 7 children or any of that stuff. That's true. So there's that. And then, of course, he gets to publish the treatise. I imagine it would have been quite hard for a woman, even if she had written the treatise, to get it published. And then he complained that it fell dead born from the press. And I'm guessing that if he'd been a woman, he might not have expressed his dissatisfaction with the book's reception in quite those terms, with quite that metaphor. Don't know, you know.
although a lot of women academics kind of do compare the process of writing a book with gestating a child. But,
that is a fair point. Yeah. So, but I think so. I mean, you know, I'm sort of I've been brought up in a very kind of traditional analytic environment, and I'm sort of quite new to the thought that maybe that environment, not just in terms of its kind of social, the kind of the social conventions and stereotypes and things, but actually intellectually there's something kind of slightly that can be hostile, are not inclusive of, you know, women, ethnic minorities, people who aren't middle class, and so on and so on. Like, I'm quite new to that idea, but I'm sort of quite receptive to it. And so and one of the things that Hume does, which of course is, you know, endemic in the history of Western philosophy, is that he starts with the mind, right? Kind of conceived as I mean, not something distinct from the body in the sense that he was a Cartesian dualist, because obviously he wasn't a Cartesian dualist, but he's interested in the relationship between the self and the world, where the self is kind of like conceived as a bunch of mental states, right? As opposed to a biological being that has arms and legs and a head and a uterus, and is having constantly having demands and expectations placed on it by its family and wider society, and whose appearance, suitability for childbearing and so on are kind of under constant scrutiny, right? So, and I'm sort of increasingly thinking, and I'm absolutely, this is my PhD student at Manchester, Anne-Marie McCallion, has been kind of impressing this on me, and I'm sort of coming round to this way of thinking that starting point is just something that can alienate women from philosophy. Like, not all women, didn't alienate me, but it does alienate some women. It's like the very idea that the place to start is taking seriously the idea that, as it were, the mind is something that is not kind of essentially embodied, right? Is just like it can make. I think that's one that's quite can be quite alien to women, not because there's something essential to them, but just for you know, cultural, social reasons. And then it's kind of like,
right, okay, they just have to be more enmeshed. They're just made to be.
I mean, you know, especially student-aged women are, you know, their visibility in the world is just made incredibly salient to them all the time, right? Because, you know, what they look like is something that is constantly, you know, what other people think they look like is being made manifest to them, and it's something that they're, you know, brought up to think that they should care about a lot. And right, so the idea that you can
it's part of their identity in a way that maybe isn't always for men.
Yeah. So the idea that we're you know, in lecture 1 in history of philosophy or in philosophy of mind or whatever, we're just going to park all of the body stuff, and now we're just going to talk about mental states, as though the body is just this kind of irrelevance in all of this, I think can strike some students as like deeply peculiar. And then they're kind of thinking, well, I'm obviously not cut out for this game, because I just don't understand why this is a natural place to start in this whole debate. It's like, you've told me that this is where we're starting and here are our available options, and I just kind of want to go, no, like, what? But I can't articulate why I want to say no, right? Because I don't know what the other philosophical views are that I might reach for that I would find more satisfying. Like, they are out there, but they're not what you get when you start out on your philosophy degree. You might get them once you're a master's student or something, you know.
Yeah.
So maybe Hume wouldn't have started from that point, right? Because especially, you know, when he was writing, that idea that you are, you know, you're a thing whose purpose in the world is to you know, bear and raise children, and I don't know, and be receptive to the demands of other people, and so on, right? He might not have started from that kind of, I'm just interested in the mind and I'm not really very interested in the body at all, that starting point. Maybe, who knows? Very speculative.
Very interesting. And obviously you think it's, you know, a shame insofar as people select out of philosophy for the sorts of reasons you've just described. Why? Why do you think it's important to have different voices in philosophy?
Well, okay. Well, so yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, sounds a bit like you're asking why is diversity good, which is, you know, not a question that gets asked very often. I mean, I think it's partly good for, you know, just moral reasons, right? It's like if people are being alienated from a discipline that they could actually be incredibly good at and successful at, by the way they're being treated or the way they're being taught or the sorts of views they're being subjected to or whatever, like that's bad, right? Because they they came into this thinking that they were going to enjoy it, and maybe this is something that they could pursue, you know, after their degree for a PhD or whatever, and that's not working for them. That
Sure.
kind of, you know, doesn't seem right. But there's also, I mean, as I say, there's a, you know, there's a kind of more, there's a sort of intellectual side to this, which I'm more, I'm kind of coming around to more, which is just the sort of like, you know, we've, in a lot, I mean, especially in sort of analytic philosophy, I think that, well, yeah, there's this sort of general sense that we're just kind of like dispassionately investigating stuff, right? We're kind of like scientists, but we don't have white coats or expensive kit, or experiments. But, you know, but really, I mean, obviously in philosophy of science, people say this about science as well, is that there's a tendency for people to kind of think that it's much more sort of objective than it is. But actually, you know, but in philosophy, I think that definitely applies. Like, you know, really what we're investigating, like, and how we're doing the investigating is just, you know, hugely influenced by a whole load of kind of highly contingent norms that we just internalized, right? About, you know, what does and doesn't count as philosophy, what counts as a good place to start or a bad place to start, what counts as a legitimate method or a good style, like to give a paper, to give a talk, to have a discussion, what students need to know in their first year, all of that kind of thing. And some of, you know, at least some of those norms are not universal, right? Like they're not necessary, and they're not even universal. So they might, and some of them might well be ones that are rooted in, you know, or perpetuate kind of conceptions of who, you know, we are, us who are doing the investigating, right? That are basically, you know, and now put in your, you know, white male, middle class, Eurocentric, Anglophone, whatever, right? So taking a more kind of pluralist attitude to those kinds of norms, like, I think that would not only help to make the discipline more inclusive, but kind of like, yeah, philosophically, you know, we should just be way less confident than I think we tend to be, that the way that we've been trained to do things, or the way that seems most natural to us, is kind of like the way of doing philosophy, right? There are other ways of doing this, other places to start, other topics to investigate in different kinds of ways, that we ought to, you know, at least recognize as legitimate philosophical pursuits that we might, you know, not necessarily do ourselves, but you know, respect other people's doing of them, and think of them as people who we might, you know, employ as colleagues in our department, or encourage as undergraduates or whatever. So yeah, I'm increasingly thinking there's a kind of intellectual sort of pluralism going on here, I guess, in the background, for me now.
Cool. So I don't want to keep you absolutely forever, but I had a couple more questions I wanted to ask. So let's get the more substantive one first. What's next for you? What are you working on at the moment? Where are your philosophical ideas focused right now?
Oh yeah, so so by coincidence, it sort of is by coincidence. I'm kind of working on something that is not a million miles away from what I was just talking about. So I'm co-authoring a book with a Swedish postdoc called, and I'm going to pronounce her name wrong now, Ulva Stulingvilling. She's a postdoc at Gothenburg and Manchester, and it's a book on metaphilosophy. So yeah, so the basic summary is there's kind of like radical philosophical skepticism about philosophical knowledge. Like, just forget it. We just can't really have any substantive knowledge of substantive philosophical truths. That's just, sorry, give it up. But don't give up the philosophy. So because what we should be aiming at is not knowledge, right? So it doesn't matter that we don't have any. We should be aiming at something like carving out the space of, you know, plausible, possible, livable kind of philosophical positions that enshrine methodological standards that are not going to be the same between the positions, but at least are kind of like broadly accepted within the discipline. And you're just going to get a smorgasbord, you know, at the ideal end of inquiry, you're going to get a smorgasbord. You're not going to have kind of like weeded out all of the alternatives apart from one.
So this sounds like a Lewisian idea, right? The idea of kind of identifying plausible or adequate equilibria.
Yeah. So it is straight out of Dave Lewis. Yes. Although he wasn't a skeptic. So I do want to be a skeptic about philosophical knowledge. I mean, I think he's probably should. Well, I think everyone should be, but I think he specifically should be a skeptic about that. So yeah, and that kind of connects with the sort of philosophical pluralism thing that I was just talking about, right? Because you know, we can be more relaxed about what counts as a good starting point and a good methodological standard if it or a reasonable way to go about your philosophical business. I think that's less of a threat if you don't think that the end game is to kind of like knock everything out apart from your own preferred position, if you see what I mean. It's kind of like, yeah, you've just put another dish on the table. That's fine. You know, as long as the dish kind of like is edible and is interestingly different from some other dish, that's fantastic. I don't need to kind of like, you know, my aim isn't to like for my dish to be the only dish on the menu, right? Other dishes are allowed. Right. So there's a sort of
and presumably you said it has to be edible, so it's not that anything goes, but nonetheless there's going to be available worldviews that are radically different from one another, but you know, equally good in some sense.
Right. Yeah. No, that's the idea. And I mean, you know, some of them. I mean, in a way, the book is very much located in you know, the kind of like tiny corner of philosophy that is basically analytic metaphysics. But I think even within analytic metaphysics, that same general point applies, right? It's like, yeah, no, we're not gonna sort out, you know, these disputes in analytic metaphysics. Like, we're not even going to sort those out, right? Given a really quite tightly constrained shared conception of what the methodological rules are. It's like there is still too much flexibility and not enough data to pin it down. But now, you know, when you start thinking, okay, well, of course, there are lots of people who think that way of doing philosophy, you know, they're not doing philosophy in that way at all. And again, I just kind of think, well, you know, as long as there are some mutually understood and shared norms in play that you know, that seem entirely sensible to sensible, well-trained professional people, you know, go ahead. So there's a lot more, right? A lot more dishes might be on the table. You know, you might never have eaten a Korean dinner before, and so it might taste a bit funny to you, but you know, it's on the table. There's a whole bunch of people think it's really delicious, you know. Perhaps it's not that their taste is just kind of like completely weird. Perhaps they're, you know, they've just got a different conception of what counts as a nice dinner. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious about the role of the sort of norms. Are they, you know, is it almost a constraint on these different worldviews that they need to be mutually intelligible? Do they need to be sort of answerable to some universal set of evaluative criteria?
Or do you know, yeah, you're asking me questions.
Adequate.
You're asking me questions I don't know how to answer because that is a part of the book that we haven't written or indeed thought very hard about yet. But we are aware that we haven't yet said very much about what the constraints might be on those norms, right? Like, you know, it's pretty straightforward to talk about the sorts of norms that are in play in, say, analytic metaphysics, because people in that space talk about them a lot and argue about them in this very explicit way. And it's very easy to see how, well, you know, if you privilege this theoretical virtue over this one, you know, you're going to prefer this theory, and if you do the reverse, you're going to prefer this other theory. And
like whether norms are things like simplicity. Yeah.
So it's sort of easy to it's kind of quite easy to see how it works in that sort of area. But now when you kind of start saying, well, all right, how permissive, let's forget analytic metaphysics. How permissive can we be? Like, because we don't want to do the anything goes thing, but we do want to do it's not incredibly tightly constrained. So yeah, I'm blathering now. I need to say something, not quite sure
what. There's a compromise to be struck somewhere.
Yes, compromise needs to be struck.
Well,
not sure how to make the compromise.
It sounds tremendously stimulating. I can't wait to read it. All right, fun question to end with. I've found out from somewhere that you're a fan of science fiction, as am I. So I'm dying to know, who is your favourite sci-fi author?
Oh, well, having failed to show up to any of the sci-fi reading group meetings, I feel, I'm in the presence of a much greater expert than me. But so yeah, I think my favorite at the moment, and this might change where I actually read a lot more science fiction than I have, is Neil Stephenson. Have you read any Neil Stephenson?
Yes. Did he do, is it Seven Eves? Was that him?
He did Seven Eves, yes.
Right.
And Anathem is another. He doesn't just do science fiction, but yeah. So his books are ludicrously long. I mean, they're just far too long. That's my critical comment about Neil Stephenson. It's kind of like you get halfway through and you think, oh, okay, we're going to do another 20,000 years of epic kind of world building stuff now, are we? Yes, we are. But he does have these he constructs these kind of incredibly sort of intricately drawn scenarios where he's done an enormous amount of research on the kind of the science and the philosophy of kind of he's really thought through how this kind of completely crazy sort of possible world might go. And just absolutely just chock full of really big philosophical issues, right? So Seven Eves, I think, is the one that I read most recently. So yeah, spoiler. But not much of a spoiler because you learn this quite quickly, right? Moon explodes, Earth's going to be rendered uninhabitable for, I can't remember, 10,000 years, an enormously long period of time. Maybe it's longer than that. And the question is kind of how do we keep the human race going, off planet long enough that we can kind of some people can go back and repopulate it. And so there's loads of the kind of we're going to have to science the shit out of this going on in the book, which I really love. So Matt Damon, that's my favorite line from The Martian. Matt Damon he's got stuck on Mars, going to have to science the shit out of it. But there's just some really big philosophical issues there about in that story about which people don't discuss in the story, right? But they're there about should we care about people in the distant future? If so, why should we care about them? Are we caring about the people? Are we caring about the continuation of the human race, and if so, is that a sensible thing to care about? Is it even possible to kind of care about people who aren't even going to be your distant ancestors, but they're people
and he has the human race evolved, doesn't he? He has some plausible scenarios about how the genetics might change and how different traits might be selected and stuff. So there's a question in there about how human our distant ancestors have to be to sort of be recognisably us as well,
right?
And then how that affects how much we care about them.
Yeah, so it's great. I love it. It's just just really philosophical. And Anathem as well, which is definitely twice as long as it should be, but that's a real philosophical kind of blockbuster. It's just absolutely, it's all sort of many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, but also there's some stuff about, there's a lot of Platonism versus nominalism in there, really philosophical. It's awesome, but very long.
Fab. I haven't read that one, so I'm gonna rush off and get hold of it and start right away.
That's quite a lot of time.
Right, speaking of rushing off, I better let you go and do all of the million important things I'm sure you've got to do. But thank you so much for this, and just welcome. We're so excited to have you here, and we're just really looking forward to seeing everything that you're going to get up to as a part of our community.
Oh,
so thanks very much for chatting to me.
Really nice talking to you.
You too. All right, bye.